Hello, and thanks for joining us for this special edition of Sustaining Us here on KLCS PBS. I'm David Nazar. The United States is in the midst of what is being dubbed a new climate protest activism, a new way for young people to have their voices heard loudly and clearly regarding what they believe are the solutions to an existential threat: climate change and global warming. Joining me now to discuss all of this, we've assembled a special research group via Zoom with young scholars from UCLA working on environmental issues, the problems, and the solutions. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thanks so much, David.
Thanks for having us, David.
Thank you.
Let's begin our conversation with this. Why is this environmental activism taking off? Why is it gaining so much traction?
So I think that people are drawing a lot of connections between different social movements. And as of now, people are using social media to build a larger system of accountability for policymakers, for each other, for our families, and for power structures at large. Us as youth, we've inherited a planet that's on death row.
The younger generation, I hear climate statistics if we need to do X, Y, and Z by 2050. I think I'm going to be 55 by then. I'm still going to be around. I'm planning on it. And so I hear that and I think I need to be doing something right now. And I think a lot of my peers are probably in the same boat.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in and say that I think for a lot of young people, we've been born into this climate crisis and we understand that it's currently happening. But at the same time, a lot of the rhetoric around climate change paints it as a future issue that will affect future generations. And we know that it's been affecting communities, especially Black and Brown and low-income communities for decades. And so seeing these people carry a disproportionate burden of a problem that they have had the least impact in creating is a big part of why young people have the passion and the rage that we see fueling this climate movement.
And echoing what Danny said, I definitely think the internet and social media has a big role in why climate activism has taken off. It's so easy now to access information and exchange information, and what's happening in one place has the potential to gain national attention all across the country. And in concern with climate activism, more people, especially youth, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we now have a space to share and discuss and organize about a shared concern, which is the climate crisis.
I kind of want to add on to that, and I do believe that it's not so much of a matter that the activism around the environment is taking off, but it's a matter of a question of why is it gaining much more publicity, just because these voices have always been here, and these voices have been here in the past, and these voices will be here in the future. So it's not a matter of why is it taking off, but of why is it gaining much more publicity. And I kind of want to add on to what Danielle said about the intersectionality of other movements and how this all ties together in low-income communities and how they function.
You all have so much conviction, yet what do you say to critics or just simply people who prioritize things like jobs or their health care or education or their financial security? In other words, say, for example, simply paying the rent over worrying about finding a solution for climate change panel. What do you say to that?
Climate change is just definitely not a standalone issue. You care about putting food on your table, then you should absolutely care about how climate change is affecting food production and how that's affecting your food prices. You care about your property value, then you should care about sea level rise, extreme heat, and natural disasters that are going to affect the risk assessments of your property value and also just the safety of your home in general. Basically, climate change is the issue that brings all this together, and we're going to have to deal with it one way or another.
In terms of jobs, I think what a lot of people don't realize is that jobs in renewables outnumber jobs in fossil fuels 3-1. And it's one of the fastest growing job markets across the country in both red and blue states. And so from a jobs perspective, investing in renewables and climate change solutions is the correct economic decision for the country's prosperity.
I'd just like to jump in to say, concerns of the rent and education and these other varied social and political issues are, of course, legitimately important. And as my panelists have said before me, it's all interconnected with the climate crisis. But it's also important to point out that there's a major inequitable distribution of wealth, not only in this country, but across the world. And it's often people with this wealth who aren't really worried about paying the rent, who are against investing in green infrastructure and against creating this just climate transition. And those are the very people who can afford to create a change for the better. So I think we should be questioning that.
Yeah, and building off both Zoe and Kristen, we live on a finite planet with finite resources. And ultimately, we're going to have to make a change, and it's better to make a change now than in the future. And we will see widening wealth disparities if we don't make a change immediately. So the new always becomes the old, and we have to make sure that we are affording communities of color the same opportunities that we're affording people who are able to invest in sustainable solutions for themselves.
Why is there that disparity, though, between people of color and the rest of society? Why is there, as you say, that inequity, possibly even an inequality?
So I'm a scholar of environmental racism, and environmental racism is the disproportionate distribution of environmental goods and environmental bads. So these are caused by either corporate decisions or institutional policies that deliberately discriminate against people of color and worsens their environments. And when an environment is degraded, it affects all of us. But ultimately, it is not allowing people who live in that space their access to a full quality of life. So we see this coming out in asthma rates, cardiovascular disease, and other diseases that eventually lead to early morbidity.
Panel, do you all agree with Danielle in her take on that and environmental racism, as she terms it?
I definitely think environmental racism is an extremely important topic, and it's kind of at the heart of the climate crisis. Because Black and Brown, Indigenous communities, these low-income communities and minority communities have been facing discriminatory practices for decades. They face a higher exposure to air pollution and climate change threats like heat rise. They are less invested in, so they have less access to healthcare. And then they have less ability to be resilient and rebound from those crises that they face. And so institutional racism and how that intersects with the climate movement is really at the core of what our climate crisis is facing.
Diana, what's your take on that?
It's not just some made up thing by us climate activists trying to push some kind of climate crisis agenda. For years and decades, communities of color, Black, Indigenous, people of color, have been facing rising health inequities, whether in regards to air pollution, water contamination, geography, and how close proximity they are to toxic pollution, whether it's like waste polluting facilities. And in order to move towards a just climate action plan or trying to tackle climate change, we can't do that without recognizing the health disparities or racial inequities that our communities are facing from climate change.
Yet certainly some could argue it's not a racial issue. Potentially they could say it's a financial issue, it's a monetary issue in disadvantaged communities, whether you're brown, Black, white, whatever the case may be. It's maybe the color is green and it's all about green, and if you don't have financial means, you're in a difficult situation here in the United States. Could that be a possibility, or adding to it?
I would say that combating climate change is much easier if you have political power on your side. I did a little, I wrote a little op-ed about research about the Salton Sea in the southeast corner of California. And basically the gist of it was the reason why there's an environmental disaster out there that has been present and getting worse and not solved for decades is that the community there, which is largely an immigrant population that is, poor and does not have political power, just basically does not get their voice heard in Sacramento. And an easy solution is not it's not available. So to me, it's about political power, and that can often be tied to race.
So let me jump in because I want to talk about something you just said, Brett, and maybe we can get Aidan's take on it. I'll start with Aidan, but why do all of you believe then, speaking of the politicization of this, why do you all believe the U.S. seems to be so divided and polarized over this issue? For example, why does the Green New Deal spark so much argument, even anger, whether it's in Congress or in the public?
This is such a big polarized issue because it's hard for people people really to realize that this is people's reality. This is my reality. Down the street, there is a factory that used to burn batteries, and in my front yard, I can't grow anything. There's lead in there that's been deposited from that factory for over 30 years. This is a reality low-income people, especially people of color, indigenous, Black, brown, have to face. So when you're talking about this drastic reality in such a way that has been brought up differently in society and politics now than it has before, there's more representation to talk about, hey, we can't justify the things that these corporations are doing to our communities anymore. And it's going to be a hard way to transition to things like a clean energy to reduce contamination. And with that comes shifting ideology of how they view giant corporations in their neighborhood as well.
Yeah, because speaking of reality, it seems each person in the U.S. has a different reality depending upon potentially what part of the country you live in, or whether you're liberal or conservative, Democrat, Republican, whatever the case may be. For some, or for most, and if you read some of the polling and the research, most people do believe we have great environmental challenges. There's definitely climate change and global warming, though they question the priority of, do we fix it? Or what is the magnitude of the problem? When you talk about the polarization panel, weigh in on that.
I think it's important when talking about this to think about the history in the US of the context of the climate crisis. So we have to discuss how politicians and industry have deliberately spread misinformation on climate change and about the legitimacy of the science surrounding the climate crisis. You know, it's been a decades-long information campaign at the federal level, at the state level. And so when people hear conflicting views from their elected officials and from scientists, it becomes about, defending your norm and what makes sense to you. And so people might lean toward listening to the people they know better, the people who they've elected to office. And so that's an important part of why this is so polarizing. People have been misled for decades, and they're continuing to be misled.
I also want to say, I think kind of the blessing and the curse of having social media and the internet and so much more access to information is it becomes a lot easier for misinformation to be spread. And I think then when you have misinformation from the internet and all of these different sources and politicians who are disagreeing with scientists, it becomes really clouded of what information to believe and what information not to believe.
So the fossil fuel industry has known about climate change since the 1970s, and since then has promoted this image of fossil fuels not being bad. So even the term climate change sounds like it's something that's progressive, or it might be slow, but saying global warming is so much more impactful because global warming is happening. We're seeing it everywhere. We see sea level rise, and it sounds more immediate. And I think that for especially the older generation, it seems like, oh, I may be gone by the time that I see these full effects. But we're seeing massive change now.
To add in that the United States is home to such diverse geographies and people. And as a result, inevitably, we're going to see different ways in how we experience climate change and prepare for it. It's no coincidence that states like California or New York are reacting more urgently to climate change while they're also at high risk of it. For example, in California, we're along the coast, and the entire west part of our state is along the coast, and our coastal communities are extremely vulnerable to rising sea levels. Every year, we're also experiencing record-breaking summer heats and more frequent wildfires. And in New York, back in 2012, when they were devastated by Hurricane Sandy, we saw people lose their homes, lose their jobs. And in response to that, New York City introduced their Office of Resiliency to prepare for future crises. And because of the foundation from that office, New York City and the state has been able to take the steps to invest billions of dollars to prepare for climate change, which unfortunately isn't the same for places all across the country. Unfortunately, funding and preparing for crises become more popular after the crisis has already happened. We shouldn't be reacting to crisis when the worst happens. We should be preparing for it before it happens in the first place. And for some communities, climate change just seems really distant. And when you don't feel like you're at risk, you might be less likely to care about it or act on it or prepare for it as well.
The country is divided. Look, depending upon where you live, we all have natural disasters. If you're in California, let's say as an example, there are wildfires. If you're in the Southeast, there are hurricanes. If you're in the Midwest, there are tornadoes. We have mudslides. And you scientists believe that the data proves that there is a relation to climate change, global warming, and all these natural disasters. With that said, what do you say to, let's use a term, science deniers, or people who don't believe your science or don't believe your data?
I think it's important to acknowledge that I am not a college student or a PhD student. I'm a high school student and an activist in my neighborhood. I feel like it's important to know that while we do need to listen to their data, we also need to listen to the stories that tie in with the data and that match the data, because when you deny science and facts, along with denying people these stories that or how they were grown up in these neighborhoods and these environments, I feel like then at that point, it's kind of a way of secluding yourself so you don't have to face the changes that are happening in the world, if that makes sense.
It does. And I do know you are our lone high school student amidst all of the UCLA students. So Aiden, thanks for pointing that out. Let me ask a question more deliberately to all of you on a personal level. So what are, for example, your personal emotions that motivate you as activists, which you are, and the activism regarding climate change? Because obviously there's got to be a way for you to strike a balance with your emotions, which I know run high, I can hear in this Zoom interview, versus simply finding and presenting what I say are viable and reasonable solutions, because right now the emphasis has to be on the word reasonable. Do you guys agree?
Yeah. So when I would talk about my emotions, I would say they fall into like two categories. One would be just the extreme necessity of the situation, something like a fight or flight response. Every time I read a paper or an article or another fact about climate change, that definitely motivates me to get back to work on it. And the other is just, I would say, like wonder at the opportunity that we have in front of us. My imagination can go pretty wild about the ways we can reimagine the way our society is powered, it functions. You know, just a little example, living in Los Angeles, I really would like a public transportation network that is efficient, that is cheap, and that takes me where I need to go. And that would go a long way toward solving climate change. So yeah, I definitely feel a lot of hope surrounding climate action.
The sense of community is extremely important, especially for young people. I think this feeling of people across the globe, you know, coming together for this similar goal, solving the epitome of a collective action problem, which is climate change. That's a big part of my motivation. As young people, it's super important because it plays into a feeling of legitimate, you know, empowerment. You know, young people are often looked down upon and delegitimized in science, in politics, in general, in our society. And so feeling that we are making progress and that people are listening to us is extremely powerful, and it really makes me motivated. But also to the second piece of your question, I would kind of fight against the idea that emotions are antithetical to finding and presenting viable and reasonable solutions. Our emotions are what fuel us to present those solutions. You know, climate change doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's an issue that is intimately tied to humans and our psychology, our emotions. And so I would be concerned if people were trying to find solutions to climate change that didn't take into account, you know, people and our nuanced perspectives and emotions.
Let me jump in, because in our few minutes remaining, probably the most vital question I should ask in this half-hour Zoom. We've talked about so many of the issues. Let's talk solutions, panel. How do we bring people together? What are some of the solutions based upon some of these issues you all have talked about?
So I think the number one thing is getting people out to vote, and vote for politicians who are going to support climate activism and support change that's going to help fight the climate crisis we're currently facing. As Brett said, having political power is having power within these communities. And I think that's one of the biggest ways we're going to be able to make change.
So as of right now, the Green New Deal is a plan. It's not necessarily a policy proposal. So it's really important that we move towards making that a policy. And like Zoe said, we need to get the vote out. And one way that we can do that, or if you're interested, is to sign up for the listserv for the Sunrise Movement. And the Sunrise Movement is a global climate action movement that's seeking to push forward the Green New Deal. And there are chapters in every major US city, there are hubs everywhere. And they actually send out newsletters with briefings as to which politicians are pushing forth climate action plans.
I definitely agree with the voting and voting green. Please do that. I would also encourage everyone and anyone to make climate change central to their career. I think most of us are doing that, and it's super inspiring. And I just love being able to work on making communities more resilient and also lowering pollution. So I would definitely encourage people to study climate change and to incorporate that into their career, whether they're an educator, whether they're an engineer. Anything you can do can be tied to climate change.
Zoe, what do you say about all that?
Yeah, I completely second everything that my colleagues have said thus far. I think as much as we can make these individual changes, having broad scale politicians making these bigger changes is really where the change is going to come.
And Aiden, you get the final word as our lone high school student.
I definitely agree with what everyone was saying, but I do believe that the next step is for folks to realize how significant the simple things that we view, such as clean air, clean water, and clean soil is to human life. Not only that, but supporting your local active organizations as well, and also supporting your learning and supporting the tribe that occupied this land before is a way to move forward as well. Yeah, a way to move forward as well, because we can learn from them and not just rely on these policies that may not get passed, such as a Green New Deal, and take matters into our own hands and kind of shape our community the way that we want to.
Because I guess in closing, right, that's what this is all about, education and learning, correct, panel?
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so very much, panel, for this very, to say the least, lively discussion from a young person's perspective about climate change and climate solutions. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, David.
Thanks for having us, David.
Thank you.
And for more information about our program, just click on klcs.org and then click Contact Us to send us your questions and comments or story ideas so we can hear from you. Thank you all so much for joining us for this special edition of Sustaining Us here on KLCS PBS. I'm David Nazar.